Like nearly every filmmaking discipline, color grading involves a ton of subjectivity. From the way we initially envision a project to the thousands of choices that we make to achieve that end result, most of what we do in color seems to be a matter of feel and personal taste. This volume and variety of creative choice in the grading process makes it easy to forget that image mastering isn't an art, it's a craft. This means that in addition to its subjective aspects, color grading also involves objective measurements and methods. In fact, I want to suggest a radical notion to you. Most of color grading can and should be navigated using an objective approach. This isn't because our personal taste is unimportant, just the opposite. Our creative spark is so precious that we should be concentrating its application as much as possible, rather than relying on it at every turn. So in this series, we're going to take a look at some key examples of grading tasks we can tackle more efficiently and more effectively by bringing objective tools into the mix, starting today with exposure and contrast. Let's dive in. So let's take a look at some objective principles and methodologies we can incorporate into our process when we're dealing with exposure and contrast in our grades. So I have a timeline here of ungraded Arri Log C material, and at this point in my grade, I have a universe of options available to me in terms of different ways I might manipulate my exposure or my contrast. I have my primaries wheels down here, my lift, gamma, gain, and offset, my contrast and pivot down below, and I've got my custom curves over here, just to name a few. However, my goal when I'm working with exposure and contrast in my images is actually to hold off on these kinds of subjective hand adjustments for as long as possible. And that's not because these subjective adjustments aren't important or that I'm not going to get into them in earnest at a certain point in my grade, but I want to build up as strong a foundation as I possibly can of objective adjustments to my image so that I can focus my creativity on the parts of this grade that only it can work for. If there is a problem that can be solved by objective means, it's generally going to be solved more quickly, more efficiently, and it's going to be more consistent in terms of implementing that solution on shot after shot after shot. Because remember, anytime we're talking about color grading, we're not talking about one adjustment to one image. We're talking about having to string things together across an entire timeline, which may be 30 seconds, maybe 30 minutes, it may be 2 hours, and we want to be consistent and efficient in the way we are transforming our image and dealing with our exposure and our contrast. So I've got 3 layers or phases that I like to tackle this stuff in, and I'm going to walk through them right now. The first of those is a purely technical and objective foundation, and that's to set up a good image pipeline or to establish some good color management. What do I mean when I say color management? I'm really talking about the journey from what our camera sensor was able to see, all the light and the color that it is sensitive to, down to the much smaller subset of light and color which my Rec. 709 display is actually capable of reproducing. This is a known technical transformation that I can make, and there's really no need to guess at it by using hand adjustments. And in fact, that's going to lead to inefficiency and it's going to lead to subpar results when compared to an objective solution like my technical color mapping. So that's always where I want to begin my process in dealing with exposure and contrast. And that's what I'm going to do right now. I'm going to do it in 2 steps. I'm going to start by mapping from my camera color space here into my working ACES color space where I'm going to do all of my grading. And then on the back end, kind of on the other side of this chain, I'm going to do my output transform, which is going to take me from my ACES working space and put me into a color space that is suitable for my Rec. 709 display. For the purposes of this video, it's not important to understand exactly what's happening inside of these compound nodes that I've built here in Resolve, and more important to understand their function. So again, that function is to map me from a camera color space into a common working color space, and then from that working color space out to my display space, whether that's for my Rec 709 monitor or something fancier like a theatrical projector or even an HDR deliverable. But now that I've set up my image pipeline, I can do all of my grading in between, and you can see just by taking this initial step, I've moved my image a good bit closer toward where it needs to go, and I haven't had to perform any guesswork or fine tune or finesse anything, and I will never have to go back and second guess any part of this transformation because it is objective and because it's technical. So this is a fantastic sort of bottom layer, a foundational level that doesn't have to call on my creativity in order to be successful. In fact, it's better without my creativity. And the next step that I want to tackle from here is kind of halfway in between this journey that I like to take in my grading process from the fully objective and fully technical all the way out to the fully subjective and fully creative hand adjustments. That next step is to work with my exposure. And exposure can be a corrective tool, but it can of course also be a creative or an expressive tool. And I want to feel free to use exposure for either of these purposes. However, the best way to deal with exposure is to think of it and implement it in an objective and photographic sense. So rather than implementing an approximation of exposure, which in a log camera space like this, Offset does a pretty good job of, I'm actually going to go into my colloid bundle over here, and I'm going to break out my exposure plugin, which is designed for the exact purpose that I'm talking about here. It's to give me an objective means of manipulating exposure in a photographic way. So for example, let's say I want to pull 3/4 of a stop from this shot. Rather than having to guess at what 3/4 of a stop might look like and going, oh, is it 22.4 or is it 21.4? With this exposure plugin, I don't have to go into that guesswork, and I can use an objective metric that's easy for me to plug in and easy for me to communicate with my collaborators. And I can say, I don't know guys, I think we could go a little moodier here, a little darker. Let's try pulling 3/4 of a stop. And I can simply type in -0.75, and this is going to exactly pull 3/4 of a stop in the same way that it would if I were to pull 3/4 of a stop on the lens. So exposure, even though it is a creative adjustment, I'm implementing it here in an objective way and in a way that encourages us not to get ultra finessey and fine-tuney too early in the process. As we've said, we're gonna have the opportunity to do that, but we wanna hold off on that kind of adjustment for as long as possible. We wanna continue to move our image toward where we wanna see it go without getting lost in the weeds of the difference of a few percentage points in an adjustment. And finally, now that I have set up good color management and a good overall image pipeline, and I have worked with my exposure in an efficient and effective way and really parked it where I want to see it, I now have sort of defined a really good playing field for getting purely subjective and purely creative. And this is really where I'm getting into the contrast aspect of my grade, the creative contrast aspect, I should say. I can now feel free to manipulate my contrast using any of the tools we identified at the outset of this video, and with these I can get very granular and very nitpicky and say, oh, maybe it's not 1.12, maybe it's 1.09, and I can feel good about doing that because I'm backboned by a really good foundation of color management followed by objective exposure adjustment. So I've got a smaller playing field that I'm working with, and I can afford to spend some time in here really nuancing the non-technical and non-objective parts of my grade and just going by what my eye sees and following my instincts in terms of where I want to take things. So I hope this gives you some good food for thought in terms of building a process for your exposure and contrast that starts with the objective and the technical and slowly works its way into the more subjective and more nuanced and hand-adjusted type of manipulations that we're ultimately going to make in our grades. But by holding off on that for as long as possible and getting our image closer to where it needs to go using objective means wherever possible, we give ourselves the most opportunity to really finesse our creativity and run wild with it where it belongs, rather than relying on it at instances where we actually have better and more efficient solutions at our disposal if we simply know how to use them. Now that we've looked at a hands-on example, I hope you're beginning to see how objective principles can be an ally rather than an adversary to our creativity. Using objective measurements and processes, we can more quickly and more consistently establish the ideal foundation for our creative choices. In our next video, we're going to take a look at how we can apply this concept to colors, specifically the way we reproduce and the way we manipulate what the camera saw. See you then.